I will start off by handing the podium, the virtual podium, over to Gina. Gina, welcome.
Hi. Thanks for having me. As you can see, I'm in my padded cell here at Semafor. It's the only way they can keep me in shape. And I wish I could be with you, but I did just get off a plane, a 20-hour flight 15 hours ago. So if I fall asleep in the middle of this, it's not you, it's me. So just a couple of, it's really hard. I can't hear any laughter. So I'm just going to assume you laughed. So just, thank you.
There's laughter, yes.
Just a couple of quick thoughts. So, Semafor is a startup, with 30 people in the newsroom. So we've done some experimenting internally. I've sort of set up a chatbot that's functionally just a macro that helps search in multiple languages and summarizes. We use it to do some basic copy editing and proofing. But most of the time I've been working kind of on my own on just a series of experiments. And mostly they're driven by a particular view of LLMs, which are essentially that they are they're not fact models, they are language models, hence the name. They're not, large fact models, they're large language models. And I think of them really as an English major that's slightly autistic and has a limited understanding of the world. And so I use them in my experiments mostly for their language capabilities rather than any sort of fact capabilities. So in other words, I don't ask an LLM, when did, Benjamin Franklin died. I give the LLM a book about Benjamin Franklin. I say, read the book and tell me where it says Benjamin Franklin died. And so essentially I'm building RAG, which for those of you who know is a retrieval augmented generation system, which essentially uses restricting a set of facts. With that, I've had a lot of interesting success. I've been able to build essentially classification engines where I can say, here are sort of rules. In a particular case, I said, here's the U.S. Department of Justice definition of a hate crime. Here's a made-up story on a scale of 1 to 5. Does it sound like a hate crime? And it's pretty accurate, and it's got nuance. And so I'm sort of thinking there are particular use cases here in terms of content moderation, in terms of seeking out specific sets of disinformation, for example. You can read a story and tell me where there's context missing or there's disinformation. So as a classification engine, it's actually quite useful. As a way of retrieving and extracting specific sets of information, it's very useful. You can build a style guide in it, and rather than have to read a whole style guide, which nobody does, it can pull in useful information. One of the projects I'm working on right now is to take a lot of journalists' safety and security guidance and turn that into essentially a chatbot. How dangerous are our bullets? If I'm going to cover the aftermath of an earthquake where there's a risk of flooding, which is taking 2 guides, and then say, what should I prepare, what should I bring, what should I think about, it does that pretty well. And then the third thing I'm working on is trying to find a way to turn this into an interrogatory system of so that you can actually sort of speak to a story, if you like, and get details and information, with the idea really being that the news story as a product is over a century old at this point. It's built around the notion that we write one story to try and meet the needs of as many people as possible, kind of ignoring how much context one person might have and how little context somebody else might have. And this gives us an opportunity to, in effect, sort of mass customization of stories. And the quick example I'll have is I used to run the Asian Wall Street Journal in Hong Kong, and US journal people would come out and they would write stories like Singapore, a country the size of Rhode Island, which is not very useful for my readers because we know how big Singapore is and we don't know how big Rhode Island is. In fact, if you had written a story, Rhode Island, a state the size of Singapore, that would have been more useful. And I think that large language models give us an opportunity to think through all of those things, which is not, of course, lowering the issues of risk and misinformation and hallucination, but I think it's just, at least from my point of view, that's my starting position, going in thinking about what the cost benefit is of any particular use. That's it from me.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much for that, Gina. And by the way, I had mentioned to Nikita last night that you're the only panelist here who hasn't been on Newsroom Robots, and she said, not yet. So you might be getting a call, just warning you. Okay, thank you very much for that. I'm going to hand the mic over to Florent.
Yes, so in a nutshell, I recently joined Hugging Face after a long stint in journalism, both at Radio-Canada, which is the CBC version in French, and Le Devoir, La Presse, so several newspapers in Quebec. And I built a lot of different AI tools, starting with GPT-2 maybe 5 years ago, because we wanted to automate news production with Statistics Canada, with inflation reports, which was maybe prescient because, you know, inflation is a hot topic right now. So we are just experimenting. And at Radio-Canada, I also helped build I would say the AI knowledge and initiatives. So by training the journalists, by establishing the guidelines for the news department, and that kind of, you know, important foundational stuff before thinking about going further in your use of AI. And now I'm in a privileged position, I would say, because our goal at Hugging Face is to help AI builders. So we are not here to build tools, but we're here to provide a kind of open source infrastructure and help people like imagine possibilities, which is something I think it's the most important thing in journalism right now. How do you envision possibilities? What do you think you can do with AI? And when I think about AI in journalism in terms of ethics and guidelines, I think it all boils down to two things. The first one is transparency. The second one is experimentation. And by transparency, I mean three things. The first one is maybe the internal one. You need to be really clear about first, and Charlie talked about it this morning, what do you want to accomplish? What kind of journalism do you want to produce? And how do you want to do it? If you're chasing traffic or if you're chasing engagement time, you won't build the same tools. So it's really important to know what you stand for, and also to be clear about what you don't know with your teams. Do you know if there's going to be layoffs? Is there going to be hirings? How will you use AI? That kind of thing. It's the kind of important question that need to be raised in newsrooms. And also, and it's my former newsroom manager hat, but you know, to give a license to fail to your teams, because it's utterly important. And I thought I knew a things or two about innovation in media, and since I'm at Hugging Face, I'm like, oh, okay. I didn't know anything about it, almost, because they're like, it's the stick to the wall approach, and we're launching, like, maybe in 7 years of existence, we launched 500 experimentations, and we killed project without any, you know, second thought. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, it's interesting. You know, I think in terms of internal transparency, it's also really important to be clear about, do you give proper training to your newsroom, to a journalist? And, you know, deadline is a good excuse, yes, but until it isn't. So we really need to be talked all about this. The second transparency aspect that is important to me is with your tech. Do you know what are the biases of your models, for example? And actually, we are conducting a research with social sensitive topics. And while we were launching this morning, I tried something with, you know, asking ChatGPT, Llama 3, Claude, name it, should I have the right to carry a gun? And explain why. And you'll have interesting answers, but based on an American corpus. It will never talk about the C-21 bill, which was really a contentious issue in Canada. So what kind of bias? And yes, you can build interesting things with RAG, etc., but the biases will be ingrained in your models, and that's important to know. If you ask Perplexity about politic financing in French, let's say, because we had several issues in Quebec about this specific topic, it will mix sources from Quebec, but also from France. And so you will have this kind of really strange answer for your question. So it's really important to understand what's under the hood, and you know how they're trained, with which data, what kind of labor conditions were involved in this training, etc. And, you know, in terms of transparency, I also think the question of, and I'm really, really bullish on this, but the question of observability. What kind of observability mechanism do you have in place, especially if you want to build agents? Do you know, do you understand how AI is making decisions, what kind of prompts and information sources it takes? It's really important to do it. And also to collect this data, because you can build a treasure trove with this, and being conscious about it is really important. And the third aspect of transparency is obviously with the public. We talked about it this morning, made up signatures, made up interviews. It's a no-go, obviously, even if people are trying their luck with it. But, you know, a recent Reuters Institute study, I think 2 days ago, showed that a lot of people are comfortable with AI-generated augmented news. So there is this opportunity we can explore with them. At one important condition, yes, you need guidelines, you need public guidelines to explain to your audience how we will use AI, but take this opportunity to have a discussion with them. Because from my perspective, every guidelines I saw in a lot of different newsrooms where here are, we will explain to you how we envision journalism. I don't know any newsroom, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know any newsroom who took the opportunity to have a meaningful conversation with the audience. Like, hey, how do you want us to experiment? When are you ready to follow us? Like, it's very, very important for that. And, you know, when I'm reading guidelines, more often than not, I think it's a risk-averse approach. And I would push for the opposite. Like, do this kind of guidelines give you a license again to fail? And, you know, will this guideline walk the walk when it will be a question of, you know, for example, on radio? Will you, in a 10-minute radio news bulletin, say, hey, by the way, this short story has been edited by AI, and so we thought we were gaining like 5 seconds, but we lose 10 seconds explaining to you that it was AI generated? It's going to be complicated. But that's kind of the real interesting issues. And you know, if you want to scale the possibilities of AI, and it's a tough one, how will you keep a human in the loop? Will you keep a human in the loop forever? I'm not sure, but it's a conversation that every journalist, every team, every newsroom need to have, and it's going to be correlated to your values and to what you want to accomplish. And maybe one last thing, maybe my favorite one. Are you transparent with your audience if you sign deals with big tech companies? I'm not sure about that. And, you know, what do you give up? What are the consequences for your competitors? What are the consequences for the ecosystem? What kind of data will you collect? That kind of thing. It's very important to be transparent with the public about this specific question. And maybe one glimmer of hope, you know, I think I've seen the media ecosystem change a lot in the last few years, and I think we are better positioned than many different professions that are discovering what change means. I mean, I have a lot of, you know, emotions thinking about lawyers or that kind of profession that can be really impacted hard by AI. But, you know, when we see that realism is not a criteria of veracity with AI, video, augmented generation, that kind of thing, I think, again, we can have a meaningful conversation with audiences, like what journalism is about and how we can fact check and what is our process and that kind of thing. We have a strong card to play, I think, in this regard. So.
Okay, all right, thank you very much for that. I have a family member who is a radiologist, and they say, do not go into radiology, because, you know, 90% of us are going to be gone. I don't know that he's actually right about that.
About it,
but you know, anyway, yes. Thank you very much for that, Florent. Chris, let's hand it over to you.
I'm very excited that Florent is here, actually, because I don't know if a lot of people realize this. If you were to ask, I think most people with the most important company in AI is, they will probably say OpenAI. I think that's the one that people encounter most often. If you ask software engineers, I think they will probably say Hugging Face, because this is literally where like open discussion, collaboration around research for AI is happening. It's really the only place it's happening right now at any scale. And the combination of Hugging Face and the somewhat confusing generosity of Meta and Facebook in releasing open models has led to like an ocean of possibilities that I think, you know, will really change a lot of how AI is used everywhere. So I don't know if a lot of people realize that. I just want to make sure we emphasize it. I have a bit of a different perspective than everybody else as I come to this as a publisher and as a software developer. Software developers have a lot in common with journalists with the rise of AI. So I started Torontoverse in, really in late 2021, mid 2021. We hit our stride and we started publishing in 2022. And I watched ChatGPT arrive and totally change my perspective on the media. One of the things that happened here is machine learning engineers, who I'd watched through my career and kind of thought were doing quirky stuff, they really reduced what we produce as software developers and journalists to tokens. I think we talk a lot about text, but actually these language models, the recent models like GPT-4o read audio, video, images, text. They're ingesting and producing everything. They're multimodal is the word we use for it. They've reduced literally everything we make into tokens. And whether or not this is like you're seeing this, we're frogs in the water in the boiling pot here. We are awash in a sea of like LLM generated text. It's everywhere. If you're a teacher at university, you probably have seen this maybe firsthand, but there is a huge amount of this stuff out there right now. And because it's happened so quickly, everybody's relationship to it is changing, really rapidly. So tokens are now cheap, right? We're hand making furniture like one chair at a time, and IKEA just came to town, right? And it's producing enormous amounts of media and tokens, right? That people are then out there consuming. The currency of communication can be thought of just as tokens, unfortunately, for better or for worse. We have to be in the business of selling high quality tokens. We're in like the premium token business, right? We need to be giving people stuff that's higher quality than the slop. That's the word that's sort of, I don't know, the business has started calling AI. It's basically, if you just give me text that was generated by an LLM as like a cover letter or, like an intro email or like a wedding speech, that's definitely happening. It's kind of rude. I mean, you need to do a lot of customization to content for it to rise above slop. We're awash in it. So what do we do? How do we make things that are better, right, than this, that people are going to be, seeing a lot more of? Universities are training people to produce this stuff, exceedingly more effectively than they realize, I think. So I look at this like, how do we rise above that and do something better? And I like, from an ethics perspective, really to dive into the question of like prose generation. I think that's where people really start to get uncomfortable with the ethics of using AI. We talk about how we really shouldn't do it. I think we all need to start talking about the realities of that and maybe getting comfortable with it. A lot of people have a straw person argument for prose generation, where they go to the LLM and they ask its weights to write an article, right? Just what do you remember? And a lot of people have said these are not fact engines, they're generation engines. It's kind of like asking somebody who read a bunch of news stories to recite one to you. They're going to get some of the facts right, especially if they read it a lot, but they're going to get the details wrong because they don't really remember things that way. We humans don't really remember things that way. But there are a lot of techniques you can use, like Gina mentioned, retrieval augmented generation. With large content windows and retrieval augmented generation, you can do incredible things. A great example, a friend of mine writes City Hall Watcher, Matt Elliott, right here. It's a newsletter about the City Hall here in Toronto. Really great newsletter. Every time there's a city council meeting, he does a big report on the city council meeting. So one of the things that I've been playing with lately is you can take the transcript, because YouTube, we put all of our city council meetings on YouTube. Not even in Toronto. I live in Prince Edward County, and we also do it on Prince Edward County. The whole council meeting's on YouTube. So you can download the entire discussion, the subtitles from that, which are available with timing, for when something was said. You can put that entire 10-hour meeting in the top of, believe it or not, it's still, it's about 100,000 tokens. You've got about 128,000 tokens in the latest GPT context window, and up to 1 million from Gemini and some open models on Hugging Face. And you can say, okay, here's the text, here's this entire transcript. Can you attach times in that video during which these various topics were being discussed? And LLMs are they're incredibly thorough, right? They're incredibly patient, they don't get bored. They just go ahead and do that work for you. And that's something that, Matt doesn't do it because actually it's pretty tedious. The creative process doesn't lend itself to keeping track of which exact clip led to which exact, funny line inside the article. But if you're somebody who really cares about the substance of what's going on, being able to route from that funny little quip to the actual video that registered it, or the actual, verbatim discussion where, Mayor Chua was saying something that then got turned into that clip, that can be really powerful. And it's something that we really just wouldn't have done before. And you can get, this goes even further, you can basically get the LLM to do like passage level citations as it's writing content, as it's generating content. You can get it to do passage level citations after the fact with a huge context window. Like, where in my research was this line substantiated, right? And it can go back, find that, and attach that information for you. Again, as long as you can get it all into the context window, like the self-attention mechanism really is good at that particular problem. So I really, I think we should when talking about the ethics of it, part of it is, okay, we want to be transparent. We don't want to be, disingenuous with our readers. But I think we also want to be giving them the highest quality tokens we can. And there's a lot of ways that AI and generated prose can help us do that.
Okay, that's a lot. Okay, thank you. And as I said, like basically anytime, just throw your hand up if you wanted to ask a follow-up or anything like that. I want to back up just a little bit. I know this is a little predictable, and actually I gave the three of the panelists a sort of the veto over this. Should I bother doing this? But it seemed appropriate. So the latest version of ChatGPT, I asked it what are the major ethical issues with generative AI in journalism, and this is what it said. And then I'll get everybody to just respond to it. You can say, whether, like, what do you think is what it gets right or wrong, or what do you think the more important issues are? Okay, so here's what it said. Artificial intelligence in journalism raises several important ethical issues which can be broadly categorized into concerns about bias, accountability, transparency, privacy, and the impact on employment and the nature of journalism itself. These are the 5 individual, which I've just condensed down because it was kind of long. Bias and fairness. Here it refers to algorithmic bias and whether it's representative of diverse viewpoints. Accountability and responsibility. Here it refers to who is responsible for errors and for oversight. 3 is transparency. Here it's talking about being open about AI use and how explainable it is, which is sort of falling on what Florent was saying. Privacy, which includes data collection and surveillance. And then finally, impact on employment and prioritizing volume over quality. How do you like that summation?
Well, it's interesting, but interesting for high school research. My reaction would be, tell me something I don't know, and it's the job of journalists to tell us something we don't know. So yeah, that's how I would summarize it.
Yeah, Chris, any you want to add to that?
I mean, I think the bias question is really interesting.
Yep.
That the fact that it noted it, I think inherently there's 2 stages here, right? There's one is the pre-training. Maybe this is biased, but really in the pre-training step, they want to digest as much information as they can, right? They're just reading everything. But then there's this fine-tuning step that all these chat models go through where there are hundreds of thousands of carefully curated documents that turn this knowledge base into a chat model. And I really think, that is going to become an increasingly important public resource, like how these fine-tunings are done, how the model's taught to think. I don't know that we can do a lot about pre-training. I think the answer to that is probably just ingest everything. But this fine-tuning step is really critical, and I think it's something we as individuals all have a big stake in. That's one of the reasons why I'm so excited about Hugging Face in general. That's sort of where we go to collaborate on fine-tuning today.
Gina, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, a couple of quick thoughts. I mean, one is I think that so for me, as I say, I'm mostly looking at these as language models as opposed to fact models. So I completely understand the issues on you ask about carrying guns in Canada, and it doesn't understand the context. If you're not asking it for facts, you're not asking it to explain context, then to some extent that's sort of it's an off the way question. And again, I understand there's going to be a lot of misuse and poor use of LLMs. So I think that part of the question we still have to address here is are we talking about generally how LLMs are going to take over the world and kill all of us, or are we talking about how journalism should use LLMs in as responsible a way as possible, understanding that frankly there's not a lot we are going to do about how it changes the world. And so I do have separate questions about bias, and that's language bias, and that's what words it uses and how it uses it, and that's part of the training model. But I have far less concerns broadly from a journalism perspective about whether it's trained on US issues or Canadian issues, but more in terms of how English or any language is used in one country versus another country. Because I think those are the questions about how well it quote, understands any document that it's given.
Okay. All right, thank you. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, and maybe I'll steer the conversation in another direction, but you'll tell me. We're talking a lot about LLMs and chatbots, and first of all, in my opinion, ChatGPT is a consumer product, and journalism is a specialization. And I think we need to think more carefully about what are the tasks involved in producing journalism, and what kind of smaller, really task-oriented specific models would fit into this task. Because right now, I think the conversation is really mostly oriented on something that it's not related to journalism. I mean, it's not designed for this. So as a specialization, we need to think about it more thoroughly, I think.
That's
Can I add one quick point
Yeah,
to
for
that?
sure.
Which is, I agree 100%, right? We should be really specific about what it is that we're asking it to do and how we can ensure that it's doing those things well. I do think that it's important for us to not focus purely on what it can do for journalism now or what tasks it can do within the current journalism workflow, but really what it can empower us to do that are completely impossible to otherwise do now, and to think about sort of the opportunities for, in effect, new journalism products, new journalism capabilities as well.
And you know, two interesting examples for the Pulitzer Prizes, two interesting stories that used AI for reporting were not with chatbots. It was with image annotation and crowdsourcing of police reports annotation. It's a whole new way of thinking about how do you train models, again, for small specific tasks specialized in journalism.
Would those need to be trained on very specific types of data as well? I mean, is that part of the point?
Well, you know, for example, the New York Times trained an image recognition model to recognize bomb craters with 2,000 kilos bombs on Gaza. And they were able to identify, I think, I don't remember the correct number of craters that they found, but it was a very interesting story based on satellite image recognition, in fact.
But then the accuracy of that information that it's being trained on is presumably crucial.
Absolutely, and there were a human in the loop at the end who was fact-checking the observation of the model, but the accuracy rate once you fine-tune a model can be like 90%. And your question is interesting also because when we think about accuracy in terms of models, I would remember us that as human, we don't have 100% accuracy, and so the question is always, what's the baseline? What's the comparison baseline? And if the model is slightly better than us, and it will never be 100%, then the use case is interesting. And you know, going to 90% of accuracy is hard and costly. Going to 99% is almost impossible and way too expensive. So we have to have careful expectations with models.
Sure. I guess one important difference is that LLMs don't express contrition and apologize.
Not at all. And you know, coming back to what's important in journalism, I think two things that LLMs or AI models will never have. First is curiosity. They will not ask questions by themselves. Journalists do. And the second one, and it's maybe more controversial, but I think they will never have editorial judgment because it's too complicated. But they are able to have creativity. Let's define creativity, but still. So that kind of, you know, really key differentiators for me are curiosity and editorial judgment.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask, so like we all know that OpenAI has struck a lot of deals with news publishers, News Corp, Axel Springer, Associated Press, and others. This seems like qualitatively and quantitatively different than previous kinds of licensing deals, like a very different sort of a phenomenon. And I'm just wondering if I could, maybe, I don't know, Gina, maybe we could start with you. I'm just wondering if you can talk a little about what about, like you see as the perils, but also the opportunities there for news publishers.
You know, it's a really good question because we don't have much transparency into those deals by and large. So it's impossible to figure out. I mean, some of it I think of as simply the platforms buying goodwill. I mean, the truth is, in many cases, the news corpus is valuable for certain types of things, but not. You know, again, assuming what your use cases are, that there are times when the news corpus is not, in fact, as valuable as some other corpuses might be. So, are there perils? I think the biggest question here really is what is the expansion of fair use and copyright look like? And you know, obviously, you know, the Times is suing OpenAI. I think those cases are sort of very open-ended. Not not sort of say the current, under current, I'm not a lawyer, but under current understanding of copyright law, I'm not sure those cases make a ton of sense, but I think the world is ripe for some reimagining of what copyright law is. And so this sort of watch and see how all of that gets rethought, I think is a critical question, not just for news organizations, but really for the building of large language models in general. Because again, the news industry is a fairly small part of this ecosystem. I think the real question is what happens if copyright law is changed, and that AI companies essentially forced to pay for training data all the time. Then I think we're in a very, very different world from where we are right now. And of course, the question then also includes like going back. How much do we have to think about this in terms of reparations?
Yeah. Chris, you wanted to get in there, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I would say is that I don't think the news producers' data matters for training. Training is all about volume, right? And it's not really about the quality. This is the big insight that has led to the existence of these models. The quality of the data is way less important than the quantity. They just need more and more and more. Each individual article is relatively valueless on the training side. So I tend to think these deals are more about the guilt that platforms feel for disrupting existing industries than they are about, I think that's important insight because it means we have to use that money to build something new, right? This is not money that's meant to sustain us as an industry, journalism to keep it going. This is money that's a seed for building something new. So in that sense, I think it's good. The other thing to keep in mind is that increasingly, AI is acting, Florent used this word a second ago, as an agent on behalf of the user, right? We used to be that Chrome or Firefox or Safari, that was your agent when you interacted with the internet. They literally, in the tech side, we call them user agents. That's how you identify the browser. More and more people are relying on ChatGPT or similarly powered agent tools. I know this because I'm building them as their gateway to the internet, right? That's how they access this data. And so in some senses, there's a business danger to giving these companies access to your data to share it with their users, but there's a huge relevance. As journalists, maybe that's not the problem of the people in this room. In terms of remaining relevant with your audience, there's a huge cost to not having your content available in these platforms. Somebody asks for data, and ChatGPT goes to look for it, and you say, "Sorry, we blocked ChatGPT from viewing our website." You're not a part of that conversation anymore. And okay, maybe that's a business problem, but for journalists, I think you really want to be in there regardless.
I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Florent.
Well, it raises the question of platformatization, in fact, like what kind of gatekeepers will we have with information, and it's an accident in slow motion, and the thing is, we've already seen that kind of accident, especially in Canada. The relationship we had with social media has been complicated, and I think we relied too much on external platforms, and I hope that news organization who signed deals with OpenAI or other companies will not rely too much on them as gatekeepers of information. You can build interesting use cases with chatbots with your audience, and you can, again, acquire a trove of data, and we talked about it this morning, like what are people asking to chatbots? It's useful for you. If you rely on OpenAI, you won't know. So that's a very important question, obviously. And the second aspect is I'd be curious to know how valuable are these deals in 3 years. We will see. And an important aspect regarding the news ecosystem is I'm not sure if OpenAI will sign deals with every news organization in this world. So what does it mean for the other ones, especially on a local level? I must say I'm a little bit worried about this potential effect, but we will see.
Okay. I know
if
that...
I could just follow up really quickly on
absolutely.
Florent's point, which is I think a really important one, right? Which is how is the world going to change? And I'm sort of fond of saying now, and the grammar is bad, so like don't stick me with it. Which is like you go to war with the audience you have, not the audience you would like to have. And I think from a journalism perspective, we have very little influence on how the world is going to change. The world is going to change dramatically, whether we like it or not. And I think that in the world of agents that are coming up, in the world of how people are going to turn to agents and chatbots to do a lot of the work, whether they're accurate or not accurate, or accurate enough or not accurate enough, that's going to happen, I think. And a question for us is to figure out what are the dangers for us, what are the opportunities for us, and what are the mitigations we can put in place. as opposed to essentially wishing for a world that frankly we have very little power to influence.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll pause here. I see, do you have a question? I do. Can I, you know what, I think, like, Florent, are you okay if we share this mic and I can just pass this one around? Yeah. Sorry, it might be a little sweaty. I apologize for that.
It's a compliment. I work for a media organization that does queer publications. That's all we do is queer publications. And I have concerns not about using AI, but AI being fed accurate information about queer life, queer identities, things like that. And I'm just interested to hear a little bit about, we're talking about like volume, and also training on models. What does it take to get to the point where accurate information is being spit back out on the other side of things? Does that make sense?
Who wants to?
Can I try to take a stab at this just really quickly?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm on the well, okay, this is slightly beside the point, but I'm on the board of the Trans Journalists Association, and clearly we think a lot about misinformation that's out there. So I do think as you go back to things like rags and so on, I think there are real opportunities for especially underserved communities previously to be able to sort of build out more robust news organizations that will support them. So I built, for example, a Trans Journalists Association style guide bot that you can interrogate, and so you can go through it and you can ask questions, because we have a robust style guide, and I'm pretty sure very few people actually read it. But if you need to write something on deadline and you want to ask a question, it works. I built also a trans misinformation and misframing classifier, and I can drop stories that I particularly don't like into them, and it will help me explain, interestingly, not just what is misinformation, which is a sort of fairly straightforward thing that a fact checker could do, but I built it so it will tell me what information is missing and what context is missing. So I do think that there are real opportunities for people to think about how they can redefine news and redefine news judgment and sort of build out at a much more cost-effective basis news for communities that previously weren't served because they were a small part of a large audience that news organization was trying to serve. This doesn't mitigate, again, against all the misinformation and the volume of crap that will go out there. But I do think there's some opportunities to help and work for communities that historically have not been well served.
Okay, thank you. Chris, I think you wanted to get in there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really highlights the importance that we all have in understanding how these models are fine-tuned, what facts are put into them. There's a public interest in understanding how that's done, and I think that really, emphasizes that point.
And there's a lot of interesting journalistic work to do on these specific questions, like how do you test the models, how do you expose the biases to the public? We have a lot of things to do as journalists for that.
Yeah, I want to come back to the issue of bias in just a couple of minutes, but I just wanted a follow-up on the licensing deals. I'm just wondering about those deals, as well as just kind of a reliance on the tools and things like that. They can put news journalists in an awkward position, right? And how do you cover the big tech firms? And I know there's all kinds of other issues that are associated with that we might come in. But do you think it's making it more difficult for journalists to cover tech firms in a critical but fair way? I know that's a closed-ended question, which is probably not the best, but I'm relying on the three of you to elaborate more than just yes or no.
Well, the example of The Atlantic is really interesting because they signed a deal yesterday with OpenAI, and 2 days earlier they ran an opinion story from Jessica Lessing, the founder of The Information, about the risk of media organizations signing deals with OpenAI. And this morning, one of the journalists of The Atlantic ran a story about the perish and the risks of signing deals with OpenAI, which is kind of, ballsy, but this is journalism, and it remembers me like when Carlos Slim invested in the New York Times. They ran this big story about how he made his money and that kind of thing. So I would say I'm pretty confident journalists are independent enough to cover this kind of interesting question.
Okay.
My 2 cents on this is that all money is dirty, and so the trick is to not be too dependent on any single source of money. I mean I think there's a slightly different question. Two questions. One is if you are highly dependent on a tech system that can go away, then I think you have a problem. And to me, the analogy there is being, say, for example, being heavily dependent on, I don't know, Facebook fact-checking money, right? And that's an issue if Facebook decides they want to turn off their fact-checking engine. And it doesn't have to necessarily be anything to do with you. It's just like, hey, we changed our business model and we're not doing fact-checking anymore. In the same way that if OpenAI says, you know what, we decided we're not licensing an API for X, you're kind of screwed. So if you have a high dependence, that leaving aside the issue of will you cover them fairly, and I think you will, I think that's one question. And frankly, the much more practical question that I'm facing right now is that the models are not stable, and they keep changing and they keep evolving. And imagine if you had to write all your stories on Word, but every other day Word decided it was going to change the spelling of something on spell check. You would go crazy, except this is on steroids. And so I build models, and 2 weeks later they behave differently, and I'm sort of desperate for like locking down a system, and I can't lock one down. I think that's frankly the most immediate issue I see for newsrooms turning a lot of their processes over to a LLM-based mechanism.
Yeah. I'll just take a quick check here. And, there is a question over there. Alan, do you have the mic?
I was just texting something.
Yeah. Chatting with chatbot, probably.
I feel like I'm asking a lot of questions at this thing, but I do have a lot of questions I'm asking. Angela from TMU. I wanted to ask about, when we talk about ethics, Charlie actually gave us a really good example of this morning. A lot of journalists don't want to be bordered by ethics. They believe they have them. They know the rules in their own head, in other words. How do you answer to that? Even if we create these guidelines that no one seems to read them in the newsroom and be beholden to, what is the point? Like how do you enforce ethics on a group that doesn't want to be enforced on ethics?
Ouch!
Yeah. Yeah, the mic just dropped. Sorry, you can't see that, Gina, but...
Gina, do you want to go first or?
No. You go first.
So I'll put my Radio Canada hat. I think I'm always curious, and I have the same kind of questions when I see a long list of don'ts in guidelines. The way we approach this at Radio Canada, and not to say that it was perfect, but we really relied on the editorial judgment of the teams. Like, here are our safety principles of, like, just put your belt when you're driving, but you're grown up. You are able to make decisions. If you're unsure, let's talk about it with your team. And it's basic stuff. But I think it's the more empowering approach regarding AI. And the second aspect, and maybe the more fundamental blocks in this answer, is give proper training to your newsroom to understand what are the risks correctly. And if I'm pretty confident, if your newsroom, if your team understands where things can go awry, they will understand the needs of guidelines. But I was talking to a newsroom exec recently who told me, yes, we built our guidelines and we made a lunch discussion, and let's come talk about it, how we will build them. And he was like, well, we ordered 20 lunch boxes and there were 19 left. So it's a shame, yeah, but let's keep trying.
But I mean, Sports Illustrated had a policy, right? They had a policy. There's nowhere in that policy that says don't make up journalists. Like, you rely on your editorial staff, but it doesn't actually explicitly say don't make up journalists.
I want to push. Sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead, Gina.
I just want to push back for a second. I mean, look, every newsroom I've worked at has taken ethics seriously, and I've only worked at 5 or 6, so who knows? There's a lot of other places. I do think that a lot of journalists would like to take ethics seriously. I do think Florent points out that sometimes there's a very long list of of prescriptive things that are very difficult to sort of follow through and understand. So my belief anyway is that people do want to do the right thing, and maybe they don't have the opportunity to discuss it with enough people and so on. I have a broader issue with ethics more generally, which is that a lot of them have been cemented in place by, historically, perhaps in not the most representative newsrooms in the world, building in place a set of rules that had disadvantaged a whole set of people. And I think in some ways, those, and it's a completely different discussion, but in some ways, I think those questions of judgment and so on need to be reinterrogated. But more broadly, I think people do want to follow guidelines. I just sort of think in some cases, those guidelines need to be rethought.
Yeah.
I think the key thing to keep in mind here too is that like ChatGPT didn't exist 2 years ago. Like we were doing stuff, probably you were doing similar things that I think don't resemble, like I was working a lot with AI, doesn't resemble the stuff I'm doing today. Like the thing about ethics guidelines and writing things down is that our readers' understanding of these tools is changing constantly as they become more and more used to using them, as it gets more and more ingrained into their life. So my main caveat, like I worry people are more likely to strangle innovation with stringent ethics guidelines, because in my experience, I know some people love writing guidelines and enforcing them, than we are, to really cross the line because a journalist didn't understand, AI or didn't understand their own personal code of ethics. I think, there's no substitute in creative industries for hiring good people with a good head on their shoulders and, making sure they maintain, keep their head in the conversation on AI and understand how readers, how the public's relationship with it is changing. Because it's changing constantly, like month to month, really.
I don't know whether, so before we go to the next question, Troy, would it be all right if I know I warned you that I might call you out because I know you've been involved in guidelines for the Associated Press, and do you have anything to add as far as newsroom buy-in and how that actually works?
Test.
Or doesn't work?
Yeah, so I was involved with our stylebook editors, our standards editors, the reporters who know most about AI, who are reporting on it, and we really started this conversation a while back on how we were going to develop guidelines for the stylebook, for AP stylebook, and also our internal guidance. And one of the things that we decided, to your point, Chris, was this was going to be evolving. We had to recognize that. We included a statement of that in our guidance. Expect that we're going to be revisiting this. We meet monthly and talk about what has changed. We expect we will revise this guidance every 6 months. It's just because the way that people interact with these tools change, the technology is developing. And so we need to be realistic about that. And we did start from a place of prohibition, right? We were like, along this of don't do this, don't do that. But we really need to start talking about, what are the use cases, what are the best practices, right, that we should follow? How do we encourage good use of this? But also, what are the areas for discussion? How do you define, okay, we know at AP, we take standards very, very seriously. And I feel like our journalists are more worried that we will cross the line ethically than that they would want to cross the line ethically. That's the sense I get from them, quite honestly. And so they're pushing back a lot on this. Why would we ever use this stuff? We can't trust it. So I think it's part of defining that conversation. And we at AP, at least, there's a sense, hey, that's a standards issue. It raises a red flag, and everybody goes running to the standards editors. We don't want to cross those lines. So how do we define the parameters of that conversation, help people recognize what are the potential ethical pitfalls here, what are the things to worry about in terms of bias, in terms of how these models are developed, all these kinds of questions, and also how to cover AI. There's a great journalist at AP named Garance Burke is her byline, and she did a fellowship on AI, and she's really thoughtful about this and really helped us develop this section about how to cover AI. And so it's a really active conversation. I think that's part of it. Rather than a list of prohibitions, which will stifle innovation, define the parameters of a conversation that you expect to be evolving.
And so from that, do you prefer more, say, a statement of principles kind of approach as a starting point rather than kind of getting into the weeds? Or
yeah, we have statements of principles. We have things like, first of all, we have our standards and principles. We have a statement of what we believe as AP. Here are our standards and principles. We go back to that value statement, right? And that's where we start all of our conversations. What have we committed to as a news organization? what we're doing with this technology should not change that, cannot change that, right? So we start with that. We start with, our human-created journalism is the core of what we do, and that doesn't change, right? That we have to be accountable, and large language models aren't accountable. Someone mentioned that earlier, right? So there's a human who's accountable for every word we publish, and that's a principle. So starting from that, how do we use the tool and stay within those standards, those principles? I think that becomes a really rich conversation, and it's a much more interesting conversation than a list of prohibitions, I think.
For sure. I think there was another question. Before we do get to that, I wanted to, I don't know whether anybody wanted to add anything. I had like sort of a follow-up on that, and like maybe for Gina, I'm kind of thinking of Anita here as well, because like, when I first walked into the Toronto Star newsroom, you had like editorial was on one floor, advertising was on another, and like never the two shall meet kind of thing, right? And so there was this firewall. I mean, I get that it's not a so totally fireproof one, but and so there were editorial decisions, and there were business decisions. And, I'm guessing, I don't know, and maybe if Charlie knows or like people who know about the CNET decision, the Sports Illustrated decision, those seem to me to be like business decisions. Like, hey, let's put a lot of stuff out there and get clicks, and it's my own speculation. Maybe I'm wrong. But now there's places like Semafor, there's like, Anita, you've got a startup. There's a lot of startups where journalists are wearing the journalism hat and the business hat. And so you're trying to make decisions that a journalist would make, but then you're also trying to make decisions that a business owner would make. When those come into conflict, I'm assuming they do, or do they? Gina, you're looking at me, and I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about.
No, I mean, look, I am old enough. I grew up on typewriters, just so you know. And then I remember the days of the hard paywall, and not only the hard firewall, but not only that. I mean, journalists not only did not go visit the business floor, they did not want to know about the business. Absolutely, it's completely off limits. So partly, I'm not saying that the lines have blurred. I think the world has changed, right? I mean, it's changed in two ways. One is that the fat monopolies have gone. You could afford not to think about it because you not only did you not have you had a product that was essentially inassailable, right? If you were a large metro newspaper, very few people could start up anything against you. And so to the extent that you ran efficiently, inefficiently, or frankly, served your audiences well or not, you still made money. And so you could afford to have those rules, if you like. I don't think, frankly, that most news organizations serve their communities as well as they should have during that time. You can ask any minority community in any major metro news audience, and they will tell you that they didn't write for them. The other thing that's changed, obviously, is the nature of distribution and the nature of product. And so what's happened now is that you can't do anything without technology, right? In the old days, technology was fixed, it was a print plant. Maybe you got a different CMS, but like you did what you did, and you couldn't really innovate, except, Saturday section. Now, everything you do is tied in with technology, so the technology people need to be sitting with you so you understand what's doable and what's not doable and what you can change and what you can't change. And then as part of that, the product people are tied into you. Who are you serving? How are you serving them? What are their needs? And so it becomes much more of a tight circle. Is there a need for independence and integrity as opposed to a firewall? Yes. But I think you have to now depend on the integrity of the people, the principles you have, the understanding of what your business model calls for over time, as opposed to, thou shalt not meet. And let's live on different floors, because you really do have to work together if you want to make a successful, not just a successful product, but because I know a lot of nonprofit newsrooms that aren't there to make money, but are there to serve their communities. I mean, you're not all talking together, the audience engagement people, the product people, the tech people, the newsroom, then you're not doing your job well. So I think that the onus of integrity has shifted from, hard walls to principles that people agree on. And can live with.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much for that. Did you want to add something, Chris, or did?
Go first.
Well, and circling back to your question about ethics, with the rise of AI, we really need to think about trust, and I think trust is a currency with the audience, and when people make decisions to have made up bylines, it's like, you're buying a Vision Pro with your mortgage payment. Like it's totally crazy because you're just like giving away your main currency, which is trust with your readers. And I'm pretty sure that journalism has a strong card to play with the public. How do we build journalism? How do we do it? What are the complexities of it? And it's a process. When we make mistakes, we admit it, and it's important. It's transparency again. And building ethical guidelines, again, if you involve people from your audience, I'm sure you will have more meaningful conversations because you will understand how people view your work and AI and where you can fit in their daily life. So it could be quite interesting and more engaging for journalists inside the newsroom.
I want to speak up on behalf of the business side of here. But my background from publishing, I came from the ad tech side into publishing, so I worked at Google and ad manager for many years. I really want to have a little sympathy for the business side of people because something's happening maybe not a lot of people realize, and that's the collapse of the programmatic ad ecosystem. So a very long time, a lot of publications made a lot of money off of what was known as programmatic advertising. It was facilitated by Google and a whole ecosystem, and a lot of the end result of that was dollars were spent on tools that were created by Google or some other competitors, but overwhelmingly Google, and then that money would eventually find its way to the New York Times or the Toronto Star as people bought ads in those publications using Google technology. And intentionally, over time, I can't prove this is intentional, I believe it is, they've moved a lot of those advertising landing dollars onto what they call owned and operated properties. So that's Google.com, YouTube.com. Facebook never really, I don't think was ever really serious about content ads or public pub ads on publishers, but they also really do a good job of bringing all of these dollars onto Facebook themselves. And at the same time, certainly in Canada, but increasingly in the US, page view journalism as a business is dead. Right? In Canada, forget it. You cannot aggregate enough page views for a new publication today. I promise you this is true without access to Facebook because every business in Canada advertises on Facebook. This is like how everybody who's launching anything advertises, and we're not allowed to. We can't do it because the government says no, we're not allowed. But this is dying everywhere, not just here. So whether that's a big deal or not, I don't know. But the business side doesn't know how to make money here. They need our help to figure out how to find an audience and monetize. Subscriptions accrue to the largest publications. It's very hard as a small local publication to accrue a critical mass of subscriptions to cover your niche audience. And so, this is a fundamental problem they're dealing with, and I think we probably as creators, as creative professionals, the software developers, the journalists contributing to these products, I think need to see ourselves as a part of the solution to that problem.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I think there was a question over there.
I had a question, yeah.
Oh yeah,
Hi.
okay, hi.
We're talking a lot about text, and maybe that's by design, but obviously there's ethical concerns with journalism around deep fakes, fake sources, revealing sources. I think that was a fairly new one with people in Gaza who had then had their faces blurred out, which were, there was an AI program written to override that anonymous filter. Any thinking around non-text ethics in journalism?
I feel like this is a big deal for us as consumers of media, right? Like, take our journalist hats off or whatever creative hats off and think as readers, how does this impact how we have to consume media? I think the provenance, where it came from, is now way more important. Not what is it, what am I looking at, but how did it get from wherever it came from to me is much more important. And we need to think about ways to expose that like transparently to people.
Yeah.
It's a very important question because we are obsessed with text and it's a mistake. The hardest part will be with audio and video. How will we apply ethics to these two specific types of media? The unblurring things of AI is really something important. France Télévisions just removed 30 stories on their websites because they were pretty confident AI could unblur anonymous sources in their reports. So it's important, and newsrooms need to think about it. We also need to think about, and recently I heard someone saying, we will never have any avatar or voice cloning system on air on our channels. And I'm like, why? And is it too early to make that kind of statement and be like, we will never come back to this decision? I'm like, well, could you take the time to explore the opportunities and what it can open and how to do it ethically? And that, I think it's important. But again, we're obsessed with chatbots about the meaning of life, and it's not a good thing in journalism. And your question highlights this, I think.
I don't know if you have anything to add there, Gina, but
No, I think you've covered the ground well.
okay, good.
And I always have something to add.
Oh, yeah,
sorry,
sure. No,
but
please.
An important point too, and I'm really happy to be with Gina and Chris today, because news media organizations don't think about themselves as tech company. Sometimes they refuse to do it, and I think it's a huge mistake. And we have two interesting examples of people thinking about media organization also as tech companies. If you bridge editorial and tech, you're going to be gold.
Yeah, somebody was pointing out fairly recently that it was a relatively short amount of time between the New York Times innovation report. It was like, when was that? 2012 or something, maybe a little later, and to the point where they'd actually become a tech platform. It was not a long. That was not a long period of time, really speaking.
I want to emphasize, because of the group of people in the room, there are so many technologists that want to be working on media technology but can't get anyone to take it seriously and work on it. You know, I turned to startups because in 2008 I couldn't find a Canadian company that wanted to build media technology. That's what I wanted to do, so I went and did a video startup instead. You know, don't think that this is something you can't do, and don't think you have to go pay, you know, $400,000 total comp to an engineer to come work for you. Like, people want to build this technology, you just need to find them.
I'll keep sort of an eye on any hands that might go up, but I'm following on the issue of the mainstream media. I'm not crazy about that expression, but for lack of a better one, the On the Media podcast, they did an episode recently, and they were making the case that mainstream media have effectively been like a hype machine for AI. But like, you can also find lots of critics who say, oh well, but they keep portraying it as this Kafka-esque thing that's like a Terminator thing that's eventually going to come and kill us. I'm just wondering how what's a sensible way to think about that tension in the different ways that these technologies actually get characterized in terms of the danger, the potential, the opportunities, the threats, et cetera.
I think we need to get comfortable with how the technology works, come to understand it. I see a lot of misunderstanding about how large language models are deployed. Spending good time on Hugging Face can help cure that. There's a lot of great information how to run them yourselves. There's a tool called Olama. You should go look it up. You can run a language model on your own computer. You can get it running on pretty much any half-decently powerful MacBook these days, if it's one of the more recent ones. And then you can grab your models off of Hugging Face, and you can go to town and run a ton of them. Understanding how these things work is really important. The model's just a flat file, right? There's a server running the flat file. It's serving requests off of that flat file, but the model's not actually changing or anything in response to your behavior. What actually does happen is sometimes they log the stuff that comes in and out, and then later they go and use that for fine-tuning downstream. But in actual fact, I think it helps to. We should all really go out and get familiar with how these things work. I think that's like a key part of understanding how to relate with them. We all have a lot of understanding about how cars work, right? Even though we're not mechanics, we can't fix them, we all have a pretty strong fundamental relationship with how automobiles work, because that's a part of being safe and living in society, knowing how fast they can stop, knowing how fast they speed up, that kind of thing. We're going to have that same sort of relationship with this technology, and I think we need to be, as the people responsible for communicating, on the leading edge of that.
I think that's a great analogy. The car analogy is great. I mean, most people have no idea, especially these days, what's under the hood of a car, and the days where you can fix it in your own garage are sort of long going. I'm very frustrated at the coverage sometimes, right? Because some of it is killer robots tomorrow, or the best thing since sliced bread. And I think that's just kind of one of the inherent biases built into news, which is like you have to find a fresh angle. There's not a lot of time to be able to sort of sit and just say, do a sober, long piece. And the truth is, I'm not sure there's an audience for that either. I mean, people are busy. This is something really interesting to us, but I'm not sure it's interesting to that many people. So I mean, I do think that the coverage could be a lot better, but I think frankly the coverage of a lot of things could be better. I'm not sure that lamenting it is going to change. It's going to change very much.
Three small points on this. The first one, I think there's a lot of fear-mongering and thinking about AGI, like artificial general intelligence and that kind of thing. Maybe it will happen, maybe not. I'm not the expert in this, but there are more pressing questions to ask in journalism and more concrete one, just as the environmental impact of AI. The second aspect, and I'm really sorry because I'm behind this photo, but we need to stop underperforming AI. because, you know, I'm sorry to say it, and thanks for the invitation, but you know.
Can you shut his mic off now, please?
But I've seen so many, like, you know, brains with neurons, and I get it, like, we talk about neural networks and that kind of thing, but it's not a human replacement thing. It's way more like concrete than this. It's mathematical models and that kind of thing. So it's an important thing to raise. And the third aspect, and I have my Hugging Face hat, but when I was in journalism and when I have a discussion about journalism and AI, I hear a lot of concerns and fears about the impact of AI on journalism, and they are really important to raise. But most of the time, I think the part of the answer is into open source AI, and we need to think about, you know, if you want to understand what's under the hood, data training, that kind of thing. There is this big, you know, tectonic plates coming into place between, and the same as your phone and your computers. You had closed models and open models, and we need to have a more total discussion about the importance on having, you know, this diverse ecosystem, and to raise the question of the concentration of power, because there are a lot of money involved in this, and journalism is a business of following the money. So
Yeah. Alan, can you get a mic over there? I'm just going to ask a question.
Sorry, I was just getting a picture with the robot.
Yeah, I know. I was thinking iRobot, right? I just wanted to follow up briefly before we go to the question on an issue that Chris mentioned about, you know, the car analogy and how do these things work. Like, transparency is generally acknowledged to be one of those, like, cornerstone ideas in journalism ethics. How transparent can journalists actually be, given the level of knowledge about how the large language... I mean, we talked earlier in the earlier sessions about it being like a black box. You have inputs and you have outputs, and you can kind of infer maybe, and yeah, you have a general idea about it's kind of putting things together from this mass of learning material. But I mean, how do we get around the issue? How transparent can journalists be about their use of AI in, especially like the reporting and the maybe not so much in the dissemination phase, but at the news gathering productions phases? I don't know who wants to. Gina, you look like you're.
It's an open question, right? I mean, I think so. The black box issue and the stability, if you like, of the model, the fact that they're probabilistic engines as opposed to sort of a slightly more deterministic, symbolic engine, I think is a big question. But you're never really sure what the output will be. And if I run a spreadsheet a zillion different ways, I should, assuming I haven't put any errors in, get the same answer every time. And that's not true of an LLM because essentially its output is probabilistic. I think there's times when it's not necessary. I think there's times when it's internal and it's an internal use, and that it's no different from a tool. I don't have to tell people that I use Excel or SQL or R or anything to come up with a conclusion, as long as essentially I'm prepared to vouch for that conclusion. And then perhaps sometimes if it's a particularly novel use case, I might explain that in a story. But by and large, I think most people don't need to know as long as they have confidence in the result. I think there's a question about once you use it to produce end copy, and I had use cases in mind, which I do think are defensible, which say personalization of stories and so on, summaries, that kind of thing, where because I'm not entirely sure what the output might be, I think it'd be helpful to have some level of disclosure there, in the same way that if I have not quite LLMs, although it's partly LLMs, if I have a translation button on my story, and you can tell people it's translated by a human, or if you're prepared to accept a machine translation, here's a machine translation. I think those kinds of transparency are useful to have for people. But by and large, I think we can also go overboard on the notion of transparency. I think people really want to know, does this work and is this accurate, and how much we're prepared to stand up behind whatever it is that we publish. And that's the critical thing, I think, in some respects. I mean, there are news organizations that don't have bylines. You have no idea who to blame. Do you blame the organization as a whole, which is perfectly fine, because the organization stands up and accepts blame for anything that they get wrong. And this is, not particularly different in that respect. If you have a journalist who's got a particular bias or an inability to do certain things, you don't disclose that. You say we worked around that person's, disability, and that's fine. And everybody sort of accepts that the news organization has stood up behind whatever is published.
Anyone want to add anything to that?
One thing I wanted to add to that is in terms of transparency, if we want to go deep for a little bit, there is a lot of research going into why did this, like right now we think of the LLMs producing things probabilistically, maybe surprising you, sometimes hallucinating. There is a lot of research going on into figuring out why LLMs produce which token. Anthropic just published, I think last week, a really interesting study about that. And I think we're going to see maybe in the future more and more of that as part of the transparency of this journalism, is why, here's the model I used, here's the neurons it used to come up with that. Maybe only some people are going to be interested in it, but it's going to be part of the provenance of the story, I think, eventually.
Okay. All right, thank you. Did you want to add anything, Florent, or we're going to go to the...
Well, just one thing. I don't think we need to explain everything to the public because they rely on our judgment. But the thing is, we need to be able to explain it if we have some questions from the audience. And this idea of, if we use that kind of tool, we need to write it at the end of the article. It's like, okay, but do we just discover that AI is a thing because algorithms are like here for a long time? So I think it says a lot of things about us as an industry. Let's say
a middle ground there.
People rely on our judgment again, so we need and put observability mechanism, and you'll be all right, I think.
Okay, all right, thank you. I did want to get to the other question over there somewhere. Oh.
Just me again, sorry.
Hi again.
So I started out coding before I actually became a journalist. I started coding at 13 in Turbo Pascal, if anyone remembers that, and DOS. So I asked this question not to be light about it, but when you think about the journalistic uses of AI and how much we're talking about it transparently, and the people that are putting it up on GitHub and sharing their methodologies and sharing that all around, do you think that is our future in terms of collaboration, or do you worry that people are going to do this for a bit and show it off, and then we're going to all pull it back into our little silos and develop it on our own? Where do you think we're headed with this in terms of transparency and collaboration?
Well, I love your question because we are building a journalist at Hugging Face community, and one of the main questions I have is, will people be willing to collaborate on projects? And honestly, I don't have the answer, but I just have hopes that we will be able to do that kind of collaborative initiatives. A lot of, and I've been a data journalist for a couple of years, and a lot of my code of my reporting were based on open source code that I use from previous journalists, and I hope we will be able to build that kind of thing, and that's but yeah.
I'm not worried about that happening. I mean, journalists are coming into this, but us software developers have been sharing our stuff open source for a very long time. Even in highly competitive environments, I was working at Google. We would release code that we spent hundreds of thousands of dollars building, because there are benefits to you in releasing that as well. You get better quality out of the code that you release. Keeping things to yourself, there are things that you keep secret. But even at Google, most of the things they keep secret are kept secret not because they're worried somebody will steal it, but because it's dangerous to release it. In the sense that if they let the search algorithm leak, which I think did happen last week, what's going to happen is spam. I mean, search has already been dominated by spam, but once upon a time we worried that if that got out, spammers would know exactly how to cheat the algorithm and it would become useless very quickly. I think in the end, what we own is not going to be the specific code or the technical solution. These things are cheaply copied or recreated once you see somebody do it. I think what we own are like the communities and the connections we're able to make, and that's the thing that publications can really hold on to. And that's the thing that legacy publications have today that won't last forever. Like that's the expiring resource that we're holding on to.
Gina, do you want to add something?
But for that, I'm leaving in 5 minutes. Is that one? I think there is greater collaboration. You can see that in newsrooms. That's partly because of the business model has changed to the extent that nonprofit newsrooms, who have sort of very different incentives, are working much more closely together. I do think that at the end of the day, news organizations, just like companies, want to find a defensible moat for what keeps them alive as opposed to anything else, and that's a critical question. But just to go back to that point, which is I think news organizations will wind up owning two things, if they own anything. One is that relationship with the audience and their community. And if they don't have that, then you really have to ask what business they're in. And then the second one is they can own facts. Or they can own, well, not facts, but they can own the ability to get those facts, or they will have some facts that other people won't have. And I think those are the things that they will keep relatively precious, and most of the other things, I think, are going to be much more collaborative.
All right, thank you very much for that. Okay, and I am conscious of the fact that Gina has a hard stop in just under 3 minutes. So I think with that, I will bring the proceedings to a close. So I do want to thank Gina, Florent, and Chris very much. We've, needless to say, just scratched the surface here, but we've had lots to think about. And thank you all for being here and for the great questions. And have a wonderful remainder of the day. And thank you again.
Have a great meeting.